At 1,645 hours on March 5, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks stood on the deck of USS Attic at Portsmouth Navy Yard in Kittery, Maine, assuming command of a vessel entirely unfit for combat. Hicks, a career naval officer from South Carolina and a 1928 Naval Academy graduate, had served on destroyers and cruisers. He understood gunnery. He understood tactics. The ship was USS Attic, hull number AK-101, a 30-year-old cargo steamer that looked every bit the part of a slow, defenseless merchant vessel. Yet USS Attic carried weapons capable of sinking a German submarine. 4 4-inch naval guns concealed behind false panels. 8 machine guns hidden within fabricated deckhouses. 6 depth charge projectors camouflaged as cargo gear. The holds were filled with pulpwood to keep her afloat after torpedo strikes. On paper, USS Attic was merely a merchant ship registered as SS Villefranca Portuguese, sailing alone through U-boat-infested waters. In reality, she was America's most secret weapon, a Q ship, a floating trap designed to lure German submarines to the surface and destroy them at point-blank range. Project LQ originated from desperation. On January 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt suggested to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, that Q-ships might help counter the U-boat threat. Admiral King, with some reservations, treated the suggestion as a directive and immediately took action. 5 civilian vessels were covertly converted into Navy warships at Portsmouth Navy Yard. No press releases, no official records and standard Navy files. $500,000 was allocated from emergency funds to obscure direct accountability. All documentation was stored in a secret file under the sole custody of the Chief of Naval Operations. The program existed because German U-boats were sinking American ships faster than the U.S. could replace them. By January 12, 1942, British intelligence reported a heavy U-boat presence off the North American coastline from New York to Cape Race and shared this with the U.S. Navy. That same day, Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan aboard U-123 torpedoed the British steamship Cyclops 350 miles southeast of Cape Sable, Nova Scotia, killing 98 people. Operation Drumbeat had begun. Over the next 6 weeks, German submarines sank ship after ship within sight of American beaches. Tankers exploded in flames while onlookers watched from shore. Freighters sank near lighthouses. Oil slicks and debris washed up on tourist beaches. German commanders called it the second happy time. American coastal cities refused blackouts, fearing harm to tourism. Navigation lights stayed on. Ships traveled alone on predictable routes. To the German submarine captains, it was easy target practice. Between January and March 1942, U-boats sank 137 Allied ships in U.S. waters, destroying over 650,000 tons of shipping, 3 million gallons of fuel, and vital supplies, including food, weapons, and ammunition. U.S. destroyers and patrol aircraft were tied up escorting convoys in the North Atlantic, leaving the eastern seaboard almost undefended. Immediate action was required. At Portsmouth, Navy shipyard workers spent 3 weeks converting Attic and her sister ship Asterion. Openings were cut in the deck for hidden guns. Hydraulic panels were installed to drop away and reveal weapons in seconds. Bulkheads were reinforced to withstand recoil from 4-inch naval guns. Ammunition hoists were run from the holds to gun positions, and all modifications were disguised to appear as standard cargo equipment. The work was a rush job, with the Bureau of Ships demanding both Attic and Asterion be ready by March 1, 1942. Even when finished, the ships were far from combat-ready. Each was a 30-year-old civilian steamer built in 1912, single-screw steam engines, top speed 9 knots, with virtually no armor. The guns were concealed and relatively light. Crews had only 3 weeks of training, most with no prior combat experience. The plan was conceptually simple. Attic would sail alone through known U-boat hunting grounds, appearing as an easy target, a slow merchant vessel with no escort or defense. According to German doctrine, a surfaced U-boat would approach to conserve torpedoes, then sink her with deck guns. At that moment, Attic would drop her panels, reveal the hidden guns, and strike at point-blank range. Supporting destroyers were expected nearby to finish off the U-boat, but the theory depended entirely on timing. The first Q ship lost was a small fishing trawler, USS Eagle. Patrolling in February 1942 under Lieutenant Commander Leonard Roscoe, Eagle, formerly MS Wave, had been briefly designated Auxiliary Minesweeper AM-132 before being reclassified as Q-ship PYC-40. At only 300 tons, she was meant to appear insignificant and lure submarines to surface. But Eagle encountered no U-boats, suffered engine problems, and was eventually reassigned to routine patrols. Attic's twin, USS Asterion, commanded by Lieutenant Commander George Walter Legwin, was almost identical, same build, armament, concealed weapons, and pulpwood cargo. Commissioned February 27, 1942, she sailed with Attic on March 23, initially on a shakedown cruise that quickly became active patrol. The plan dispersed the two ships to cover coastal shipping lanes, 480 miles apart after 5 days, but in reality, this distance prevented any meaningful mutual support. On the night of March 26, the Asterion, 240 miles south of Attic, picked up faint distress signals around 20:45 hours Eastern Wartime, SOS, torpedoed ship. Signals were weak, fragmented, nearly unreadable. Lieutenant Commander Legwin ordered a course change toward the source, but the position was uncertain. Asterion searched through the night. By first light on March 27, lookouts saw nothing, no ship, wreckage, survivors, or U-boats. The sea was empty. Asterion continued sweeping the area in a grid pattern, and at 1,400 hours, they discovered scattered debris, small pieces of wood, cork floats, an empty life jacket, and oil slicks. The wreckage spanned several square miles, with no way to identify the ship it had originated from. It could have been any of dozens of vessels sunk in recent weeks. Asterion searched until dark. Found nothing else. Legwin faced a decision: continue searching or resume his assigned patrol. He chose to resume patrol. Asterion was supposed to be hunting U-boat, not conducting search and rescue operations. Other ships could handle that mission. Legwin took Asterion back to her assigned area and continued the Q-ship mission for another 4 days. She saw no U-boat, encountered no targets. On March 31, Asterion received orders to return to port. The Navy was starting to realize that Project LQ was not working. Back in Portsmouth, Legwin filed his patrol report. He mentioned the distress call and the wreckage. Intelligence officers compared his report with other information. They concluded that the distress call had probably come from USS Adi. Asterion had been the closest ship to Attic when she was attacked, but Asterion had been too far away to help. By the time she reached the area, Attic had been gone for 12 hours. The wreckage Asterion found might have been from Ike, or it might have been from one of the other ships sunk that week. There was no way to know for certain. The third ship in Project LQ was USS Bighorn, a tanker converted to look like a civilian oiler. She sailed in April 1942 under the command of a Navy captain. Bighorn spent 6 weeks at sea. No U-boat contacts. She returned to port in May with nothing to report. The program was failing, not because the Q-ships were ineffective, but because U-boat were learning to be cautious. German submarine commanders had fought British Q-ships in World War. They knew the tactic. They knew that some merchant ships were armed. By March 1942, German intelligence had warned all U-boat commanders to be wary of suspicious-looking cargo vessels sailing alone in convoy routes. Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks knew the odds. He had been briefed on the program. He knew that British Q-ships in World War I had mixed success at best. He knew that Project LQ was experimental. He knew that 4 previous Q-ship patrols had produced 0 U-boat kills. He knew that Attic was slow, barely armed, and vulnerable. But Hicks believed in the mission. Hicks was born in Kentucky, grew up in a small town, joined the Navy in 1926. He worked his way up through the enlisted ranks before attending officer candidate school. He served on destroyers and cruisers. He knew gunnery. He knew tactics. He had trained his crew for 3 weeks on how to operate the concealed weapons, how to drop the panels, how to aim under combat conditions, how to stay hidden until the last possible moment. The crew of USS Attic consisted of 141 men, officers, petty officers, gunners, engine room crew, deck hands. Most were in their 20s, some were teenagers, a few were in their 30s. They came from every part of America, farm towns, industrial cities, coastal communities. Some had been in the Navy for years. Others had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. They all knew they were sailing into danger. On the morning of March 23, 1942, I cast off from Portsmouth Navy Yard at 1,300 hours. The weather was clear, cold, north wind. Arctic looked exactly like an old cargo steamer. Rust streaks on the hull, faded paint, no visible weapons, no Navy markings. She flew no flag, just another merchant ship heading out to sea. Shipyard workers watched from the dock as Attic disappeared beyond the harbor breakwater. All anyone could do was wait. The fire/ins engagement happened on the night of March 26, 1942. Attic was cruising alone 300 m east of Norfolk, Virginia. The sea was moderate, overcast sky, limited visibility. At 1,700 hours, a lookout on U-123 spotted smoke on the horizon. Capitan Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan was on his second patrol off the American coast. He had already sunk 9 ships on this mission. His crew was experienced. They had been hunting for 3 weeks. They knew what to look for. Capitan Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan was 29 years old in 1942. Born March 18, 1913, he had originally trained as a naval aviator before. Injuries from a crash brought him to the U-boat service in November 1939. He took command of U-123 in May 1941. By March 1942, he was on his second patrol to American waters, and he had already proven himself as one of Germany's most effective submarine commanders. On December 23, 1941, U-123 had departed Lorient, France, as part of Operation Drumbeat. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had selected only 5 Type 1X long-range submarines for the first wave of attacks against the American coast. U-123, U-130, U-66, U-125, and U-109. These boats had the range to cross the Atlantic, operate for weeks off the American seaboard, and return to France. Most German U-boat could not make that journey. The Type YX boats were larger, had more fuel capacity, and could carry more torpedoes than the standard Type 51 submarines that operated in the North Atlantic. Hartigan's mission was to penetrate close to New York Harbor and sink as much shipping as possible. On January 12, 1942, he sank the British freighter Cyclops off Nova Scotia, inaugurating Operation Drumbeat ahead of schedule. Over the next 3 weeks, he moved south along the American coast, sinking ship after ship, tankers, freighters, cargo vessels. Most were sailing alone, fully lit, following predictable routes. American coastal cities refused to implement blackouts. Navigation lights remained on for U-boat commanders. It was almost too easy. Hartigan later wrote in his patrol log that it was unbelievable how unprepared the Americans were. The entire coastline was lit up like a carnival. Ships were silhouetted against the glow of coastal cities. On his first patrol, Hartigan sank 9 ships, totaling 53,000 tons. He returned to Lorient on February 9, 1942 and was awarded the Knight's Cross. After refitting and resupply, U-123 departed on March 24 for a second patrol. Hartigan's orders were the same. Hunt American shipping. Sink everything possible. Conserve torpedoes when feasible by using the deck gun on smaller defenseless targets. Return when ammunition or fuel ran low. Wing U-12. 3's lookout spotted on the evening of March 26. Hartigan studied the target through his binoculars. Old cargo steamer. Single funnel. Slow speed, no. Escort, no defensive armament visible. Exactly the kind of ship that was not worth wasting a torpedo. Hartigan decided to shadow the target until conditions were optimal, then surface and attack. Standard procedure. Save the torpedoes for more valuable targets. U-123 followed Attic for hours, staying submerged, staying out of sight, watching, waiting. At 19:37 hours, Hartigan gave the order. U-123 surfaced. The submarine moved to firing position. Range 700 yards, Hartigan fired one G-7E torpedo. The torpedo struck Attic on the port side under the bridge. The explosion was massive. Fire erupted from the cargo holds. The ship listed slightly to port. Men could be seen running on deck. A lifeboat was lowered on the starboard side. It looked like a normal merchant ship taking a torpedo hit. Crew abandoning ship. No weapons. No defense, just another victim. Hartigan moved U-123 around Attic's stern to finish the job. That was when Hicks gave the order. The hydraulic panels dropped. The 4-inch gun swung into position. 8 machine guns opened fire. The first 4-inch shell landed short of U-12-3, sending up a massive splash. The second shell was off in deflection. The third missed high. The machine gun fire radded the submarine's conning tower. One round struck Friday Zurseals, a midshipman standing watch on the bridge. He went down with a chest wound. Hartigan reacted instantly, full throttle. Emergency dive procedures. U-123's diesel engines poured out black smoke as the submarine accelerated away from Attic. The gunners kept firing. But the target was moving fast and presenting a narrow profile. The shells missed. U-123 submerged before Attic could land a killing shot. Hartigan had been incredibly lucky. He had come within seconds of being destroyed. His submarine had taken machine gun fire. One of his crew was dying, but the boat was intact. He could still fight. U-123 circled underwater and approached Ike from a different angle. At 2,129 hours, Hartigan fired a second torpedo. This one hit Ike's engine room. The explosion destroyed the boilers. Steam and smoke poured from the hull. The single propeller stopped turning. Attic was dead in the water. Bows settling, stern rising. The crew was abandoning ship in earnest now. Lifeboats in the water, men jumping overboard. Hartigan surfaced at 0327 hours to watch Attic sink. The ship was still afloat. Stubborn, refusing to go down. The pulpwood cargo was keeping her buoyant, despite the torpedo damage. At 2,250 hours, something inside Attic detonated. The ship exploded. A massive blast that lit up the night sky. Debris flew hundreds of feet into the air. When the flames cleared, USS Attic was gone. Nothing remained but wreckage and oil. 141 men dead. The entire crew, no survivors. The lifeboats had been in the water, but a severe gale blew in immediately after the explosion. The storms had killed anyone who survived the blast. Hartigan buried Fari Zuri Rudi Halzer at sea 10 minutes later. 1 German casualty, 141 American casualties. U-123 left the area and continued hunting. The first search aircraft arrived at Attic's last reported position at 0800 hours on March 27, a U.S. Army Air War bomber from the 1st Bomber Command. The pilot flew a grid pattern for 4 hours. He found nothing. No wreckage, no survivors, no oil slick. The storm had scattered everything across miles of ocean. The visibility was poor. Whitecaps made it nearly impossible to spot debris. USS Noah, a Clemson-class destroyer, commissioned in 1918, steamed to the site under the command of Lieutenant Commander Harold Groford. Noah was one of the few destroyers available on the eastern seaboard. Most had been assigned to convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic. Noah searched for 12 hours, methodically covering the area where Attic had transmitted her distress signals. The crew spotted small pieces of debris, life jackets, wooden planks, cork floats, nothing that could definitively be identified as coming from U.S. SIC. The ship had simply disintegrated. USS Sagamore, a fleet tug designated at 20, attempted to reach the area, but was forced back by heavy seas. The Atlantic was notoriously dangerous in late March. Storm systems moved through regularly. Wind speeds exceeded 40 knots. Waves ran 15 to 20 feet. Small vessels like tugs could not operate safely in those conditions. On March 30, 3 days after the sinking, patrol aircraft found 5 empty lifeboats drifting approximately 80 miles south of the attack site. The boats had been blown off course by the gale. They were empty. No bodies, no supplies, no indication of what had happened to the men who had launched them. The lifeboats were marked with USS Attic's identification numbers. That was the only physical evidence ever recovered. The 141 men were simply gone, swallowed by the Atlantic. What nobody in the U.S. Navy realized at the time was that the Germans knew exactly what had happened. On April 9, 1942, Radio Berlin broadcast a message. The High Command said today that a boat of 3,000 tons was sunk by a torpedo after a battle fought partly on the surface with artillery and partly beneath the water with bombs and torpedoes. The Germans knew about Project LQ. They knew the Americans were using Q ships. They knew USS Arctique was not a merchant vessel. German intelligence had been tracking the program. U-boat commanders received warnings to watch for armed merchant ships operating alone. The element of surprise was gone. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, was furious. Project LQ had been his response to Roosevelt's suggestion to use Q ships. The program had cost $500,000, 5 ships converted, months of training, complete operational security, and it had produced 0 U-boat kills. Worse, USS Attic had been sunk on her first patrol with all hands. The Germans had broadcast the kill to the world. The program was exposed. King ordered an immediate review. The review was brutal. Q ships were too slow to chase U-boat, too lightly armed to fight surface engagements, too vulnerable to torpedoes. The crews had inadequate training. The doctrine was flawed. German U-boat commanders were too experienced to fall for the trap. Supporting forces were too far away to help when Q ships got in trouble. The whole program was a waste of resources. King ordered all Q ship patrols suspended. USS Estienne was recalled from patrol in April 1940. 2 USS Bighorn completed 1 more patrol in May and was reassigned to cargo duty. USS Eagle was decommissioned. USS Captor was sent to the Pacific where she served as a patrol vessel but never engaged an enemy submarine. The only Q ship that saw any real action was USS Anacapa in the Pacific, and she almost sank 2 American submarines by accident when they entered her patrol area without proper identification. By August 1942, Project LQ was over. Then the Germans started noticing something strange. In May 1942, U-boat losses began to increase. 3 submarines were sunk in American waters. In June, 5 more went down. In July, 7 submarines were destroyed. The kills were not from Q ships. They were from destroyer escorts, patrol aircraft, and improved convoy tactics. The United States Navy had learned. Convoys were organized. Air coverage was extended. New radar systems were deployed. Depth charges were improved. Destroyer escorts were built specifically for anti-submarine warfare. The tactics that worked were not Q ships, They were coordinated air and sea patrols with proper equipment and training. By September 1942, German submarine operations off the American coast became too dangerous. U-boat commanders were ordered to focus on mid-Atlantic convoy routes where American defenses were weaker. Operation Drumbeat was over. The second happy time had ended. Between January and August 1942, the entire German U-boat campaign in Operation Drumbeat sank 397 Allied ships in American waters. Over 2 million tons of shipping, approximately 5,000 merchant sailors killed, cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars lost. Reinhard Hartigan himself was credited with sinking 22 ships totaling 114,000 tons across his entire career, but the rate of sinking was dropping. American shipyards were building Liberty ships faster than U-boat could sink them. The convoy system was working. Air patrols were effective. Radar was finding submarines before they could attack. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hartigan returned to Lorient on May 2, 1942. He had completed 2 patrols during Operation Drumbeat. He sank 19 ships totaling 90,000 tons across both patrols combined. He received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, Germany's highest military decoration. Adolf Hitler personally awarded him the medal at his headquarters in East Prussia. Photographs from that meeting show Hartigan, pale and thin after weeks at sea, standing at attention while Hitler pinned the oak leaves to his uniform. But Hartigan was done with combat patrols. The physical and psychological strain of submarine warfare had taken its toll. On July 31, 1942, he relinquished command of U-123. He was assigned to training duty first with the 27th U-boat Training Flotilla in Gotenhagen, then as chief of U-boat training at the torpedo school at Marine Schule Mervik. Later in the war, he worked in the torpedo weapon department, overseeing testing and development of new acoustic and wire-guided torpedoes. In the final months of the war, he served as a battalion commander in Marine Infantry Regiment 6, fighting against British forces in the area around Bremen. Most of the officers in that unit were killed. Hartigan survived only because he was hospitalized with a severe case of diphtheria in the last days before German surrender. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, British troops arrested Hartigan. He spent 18 months as a prisoner of war before being released in late 1946. He returned to Bremen and started an oil trading business. The business was successful. Hartigan became wealthy. He served on Bremen's city council for 32 years from 1952 to 1984, representing the Christian Democratic Union Party. He was active in veterans affairs and maintained contact with other former U-boat commanders. In interviews later in life, Hartigan was careful about how he discussed the war. He said he was not a Nazi. He did his duty for his country, not for Hitler. He stated that by 1942 he and his crew had realized Hitler was a madman driving Germany toward catastrophe. He expressed skepticism about some aspects of Nazi atrocities, though historians note he was secluded at training bases and never served on the Eastern Front where the worst crimes were committed. When asked about the merchant sailors he had killed, Hartigan maintained that he had tried to help survivors when possible. He claimed he provided food and navigation directions to lifeboats. He ordered neutral ships to pick up survivors. He believed in fighting honorably even in submarine warfare. Historical records partially support these claims. Survivors from several ships Hartigan sank reported that the U-boat surfaced in the commander directed them toward the nearest land or shipping lanes. In at least one documented case, Hartigan forcibly stopped a neutral ship and ordered it to rescue survivors from a tanker he had just sunk. But other survivors reported no such assistance. The reality was complex. Submarine commanders had to balance humanitarian impulses against their own survival. Stopping to help survivors exposed the submarine to counterattack. Spending time on the surface in hostile waters was extremely dangerous. Most commanders, including Hartigan, helped when they could do so safely. When they could not, they left survivors to their fate. Hartigan never mentioned USS Attic, specifically in his memoirs or interviews. The engagement lasted only a few hours. To him, it was just another merchant ship, just another target. He did not realize Attic was a Q ship until German radio broadcast the news on April 9. Even then it did not register as particularly significant. He had survived. His boat had survived. He sank the enemy vessel. Mission accomplished. Move on to the next target. The fact that 141 American sailors died in that encounter apparently did not trouble him. They were the enemy. They were trying to kill him. He succeeded. They failed. That was war. Hartigan lived to be 105 years old. He died on June 9, 2018 in Bremen, Germany. He was the last surviving U-boat ace from Operation Drumbeat. German newspapers published lengthy obituaries. They called him a naval hero. They praised his courage and skill. They noted his post-war civilian service. Most obituaries briefly mentioned that he had sunk 22 ships during the war. A few mentioned USS Attic specifically as the only American Q ship sunk in World War II. None mentioned the 141 men who died when Attic exploded. For administrative purposes, Rear Admiral Russell Wilson wrote in a memorandum on July 2, 1942, the ship should be considered lost on March 27, 1942. He added that aside from notifications already made to dependent, no further publicity would be given to the loss of this ship. USS Arctic was classified. The mission was secret. The loss was not announced publicly. The families of the crew members received telegrams. Missing in action, lost at sea. No details provided. No explanation given. Official death notifications were not sent to families until April 5, 1944, more than 2 years after the sinking. The Navy did not officially acknowledge that USS Attic existed until after the war ended. When German records were translated, they revealed the full story. U-123 had engaged in sunken American Q ship on March 27, 1942. The submarine had been lured into a surface engagement. The Q ship had opened fire and almost destroyed the U-boat, but the submarine escaped and came back to finish the job. 141 Americans died, 1 German died. The battle lasted approximately 3 hours. The official U.S. Navy history of Project LQ was written after the war based on records maintained in secret files by the Chief of Naval Operations during the conflict. The assessment was honest. The Q ship program was a failure. The concept was flawed. The execution was poor. The results were non-existent. 0 U-boat sunk. 1 Q ship lost with all hands. Millions of dollars wasted. The analysis recommended that Q ship tactics should never be used again. Modern submarines were too fast and too well armed. Surface ships could not compete. The only effective anti-submarine weapons were aircraft destroyers with sonar and depth charges and convoy escorts. Q ships belonged to World War I. They had no place in modern naval warfare. The fundamental problem was that Q ships required submarines to surface and close to gun range. That tactic had worked in World War I when submarines had limited battery and capacity and spent most of their time on the surface. But by World War II, submarines had better diesel engines, larger batteries, and could remain submerged for extended periods. More importantly, German submarine commanders had studied British Q ship tactics from the previous war. They knew the signs to look for: a ship sailing alone in dangerous waters, no escorts, suspiciously good condition for a supposedly civilian vessel, crew that seemed too disciplined, unusual handling characteristics. German standing orders by 1942 explicitly warned commanders to be cautious of potential Q ships. When in doubt, attack from maximum range with torpedoes. Do not surface. Do not close to gun range. Do not give the enemy a chance to surprise you. Hartigan had violated those standing orders when he engaged Ike. He surfaced. He closed to 700 yards. He planned to use his deck gun and he nearly paid for that decision with his life and his boat. The fact that Arctic damaged U-123 and killed 1 crewman proved the Q ship concept could work, at least in theory. But 1 damaged submarine was not worth the loss of 141 trained sailors and an entire ship. The mathematics were brutal. Project LQ consumed resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. The 5 ships required crews totaling over 500 men. Those sailors could have manned destroyer escorts or patrol craft. The 5 vessels needed fuel, munitions, provisions, upkeep, and port facilities. All of those assets were urgently required for other missions in early 1942. The $500,000 allocated to Project LQ could have funded other anti-submarine initiatives, enhanced depth charges, improved sonar systems, additional patrol planes, or training for escort crews. Any of those investments would likely have yielded better outcomes than Q ships. Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks was never recovered. His remains were lost. None of the crew survived. The explosion that obliterated USS Attic left nothing intact. No bodies, no personal belongings, just debris scattered over miles of ocean. The Navy officially listed Hicks and his entire crew as killed in action on March 27, 1942. They are commemorated on the tablets of the missing at various military cemeteries. Their names are engraved in stone, yet they have no graves. They rest somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles east of Norfolk, Virginia. The precise location of the wreck is unknown. In 1990, historian Michael Gannon released Operation Drumbeat, a detailed account of the German U-boat campaign off the American coastline. Gannon spent years examining German and American records. He conducted extensive interviews with Reinhard Hartigan and analyzed the logs of U-123. He scrutinized the tactics employed during Operation Drumbeat. In his work, Gannon devoted considerable attention to USS Attic and Project LQ, calling it one of the most misguided programs of the conflict, a waste of vessels and lives, a desperate measure addressing a crisis that demanded better solutions. He estimated that the funds spent on Project LQ could have built 2 destroyer escorts, which would have been far more effective at hunting U-boats. He noted that the 141 men who perished aboard USS Attic were trained sailors who could have served on other ships where they might have survived and contributed meaningfully to the war effort. Gannon concluded that Project LQ exemplified how desperation can lead to poor decision-making. The program was initiated because President Roosevelt sought a quick solution to the U-boat menace. Admiral King carried it out because he felt compelled to act. The Navy converted 5 vessels because there was political pressure to do anything to counter the U-boat threat. But nobody asked whether Q ships could realistically operate in modern naval warfare. Nobody questioned whether tactics barely effective in World War I would succeed against skilled U-boat commanders in 1942. Nobody weighed the risks against the potential gains. The program was doomed from inception. USS Attic and her crew bore the cost of that failure. The wreck of USS Attic has never been located. The Atlantic is deep where she sank, and currents are strong. Debris from World War II ships is scattered along the eastern seaboard. Fishing boats occasionally haul up metal fragments, but identifying the source is nearly impossible. USS Attic could be anywhere within a 100 square mile area. She might remain intact or broken into pieces. The pulpwood cargo could have rotted away decades ago. The guns could be buried under sand. The hull could be covered in marine growth. No one knows. No one is actively searching. There are too many wrecks, too much ocean, and too few resources. USS Attic is just one more casualty of a war fought 80 years ago. This is how failure occurs in wartime, not due to incompetence or cowardice, but because of desperation and flawed judgment. Under pressure, leaders sometimes pick the wrong solutions. When options are limited, they may settle for the least bad alternative rather than wait for better ones. When resources are scarce, they may squander them on programs destined to fail. Project LQ was not the product of ill intent. It was conceived by desperate individuals attempting to save lives and confront an advancing enemy. Yet desperation is not strategy, pressure is not wisdom, and hasty action is not always the correct course. USS Attic and 141 sailors died because someone believed Q ships were the answer to the U-boat threat. They were not. The real solution lay in convoys, air patrols, radar, sonar, destroyer escorts, and time. Those approaches took longer to implement, were less sensational, and did not make headlines, but they worked. By the end of 1943, the U-boat threat was largely contained. By mid-1944, German submarines were being hunted and destroyed faster than Germany could produce them. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, yet USS Attic and her crew never witnessed that victory. They perished in March 1942, just 3 months into America's war, aboard a vessel unfit for combat, facing an enemy with outdated tactics. What ultimately defeated the U-boats was not cunning tricks or traps, but the systematic application of technology, tactics, and resources. Convoy escort became standard by mid-1942. Every merchant vessel crossing the Atlantic traveled in organized groups protected by destroyers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes. The escorts were outfitted with sonar, depth charges, and increasingly effective radar. They operated as coordinated units, sharing intelligence and covering each other's blind spots. When a U-boat attacked a convoy, it faced immediate retaliation from multiple ships. Air cover extended ever farther into the Atlantic as long-range patrol aircraft entered service. The modified B-24 Liberator could fly nearly 2,000 miles from base. These planes carried radar that could detect surface submarines from miles away, along with depth charges capable of attacking U-boats before the subs even realized they were present. The infamous Atlantic Gap mid-ocean areas beyond land-based aircraft reach shrank monthly as new bases were built in Greenland, Iceland, and the Azores. By late 1943, there was no gap. Every convoy received air protection throughout its voyage. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls, provided coverage even in the central Atlantic. These carriers embodied what Project LQ should have been: merchant-looking ships sailing with convoys, but providing aircraft capable of hunting submarines from above. The escort carriers worked. They sank U-boats. They safeguarded convoys. They were worth every dollar invested. Technology advanced rapidly. Sonar became more precise. Depth charges became more powerful. Hedgehog and Squid anti-submarine mortars fired multiple charges ahead of attacking ships, improving hit probability. Radar could detect periscopes and even snorkels. Direction-finding equipment located U-boats by radio transmissions. Code-breaking capabilities improved. By mid-1943, Allied intelligence regularly intercepted German naval communications. Convoy routes were adjusted to avoid known U-boat concentrations, and task forces hunted submarines identified via decrypted messages. Training advanced dramatically. New destroyer escort crews spent months in specialized schools mastering anti-submarine tactics. They practiced attack runs, studied U-boat behavior, and learned to operate as teams. By 1944, American and British escort crews were highly skilled professionals. Industrial production overwhelmed the German submarine threat. U.S. shipyards built Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, over 5 million tons in 1942, over 19 million tons in 1943. With 1944 surpassing any prior year. Even at their 1942 peak, U-boats sank fewer than 8 million tons annually. The numbers were unsustainable. Most importantly, the Allies never relented. When tactics failed, they devised new ones. When technology fell short, they created better tools. When training was insufficient, they improved it. When resources were limited, they produced more. Victory in the Atlantic came through relentless, methodical improvement. Project LQ represented the opposite approach, a desperate gamble on an unproven concept, relying on outdated World War I tactics, wasting resources, sending men to sea on unready ships, and quietly abandoned when it failed without extracting meaningful lessons. The lesson was not that Q ships could not work, but that gimmicks do not win wars. Steady application of proven methods wins wars. Technology, training, resources, and perseverance win wars. USS Attic demonstrated that lesson at the cost of 141 lives. If you found this account meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We strive to share forgotten World War II stories, missions ignored in official histories, ships and sailors who served and died without recognition. These accounts matter because war is not only about celebrated victories, it is also about failures, mistakes, and lives lost pursuing solutions that did not succeed. USS Attic embodies a painful truth. Sometimes courage alone is insufficient. Sometimes determination alone is insufficient. Even the best intentions can lead to tragedy. The 141 men aboard USS Attic were courageous. They knew the danger. They sailed anyway. They deserved better than to perish on an unready ship executing an unviable plan, in a program cancelled 3 months after their deaths. Their names are etched on memorial walls, but their story remained classified for decades. Most Americans have never heard of USS Attic. Most historians omit Project LQ. The program was an embarrassment, a failure, something the Navy wished to erase. But forgetting failures risks repeating them. Remembering USS Attic means remembering that wars are won not by desperate gambles but by careful planning, proper equipment, realistic tactics, and the ability to acknowledge when a method is failing. The United States prevailed in the Battle of the Atlantic because the Navy abandoned failed programs like Project LQ and concentrated on solutions that actually worked. That lesson cost 141 lives. We should not forget them.